Hi, everyone. Welcome to the video on writing your discussion. Now, note in the assignment what is said about your discussion. The assignment is a really great go-to, including understanding what headings you need. So the discussion will be a centered heading. Now, except for one exception, which is that these pieces actually can be blended together. And I'll show you that in the example. So essentially in the discussion, there's three elements. You need to summarize the main point of the paper. So you usually refer to the purpose. So you go back to your introduction, you refer to the purpose and significance. And sometimes this will actually cause you to rewrite the introduction a little bit as you realize that the purpose and the significance is slightly different, right? So what's the purpose of this study? So you revisit that a little bit, and then you summarize the main points of the findings for your reader. So you are doing essentially, even though sometimes it seems a bit repetitive, what it means is that you are doing the intellectual work for your reader to say, this is what you should take away. Then you will discuss how your findings relate to your theoretical framework and the existing literature. Often these things happen in tandem, right? Because as you summarize each of the main points of the findings, you will talk about how they're related to the literature. However, you will see examples out in the literature where they do those things separately. Now, usually this next piece is actually a separate subheading, which is your implications. This is really important. And again, you're doing the intellectual work for your reader. And you are also continuing to make an argument about why this work is important. And that is that you detail what the findings mean, like how do we apply these findings, right? Particularly for practitioners, right? Because you are amazing researcher practitioners. You deeply understand the practitioner context. You know what we need to do for equity and justice. And now you have this evidence, these findings that you have researched that you can then carry into practice. So you might have some points for practitioners in the context you're researching, like, you know, folks here need to think about doing such and such. And you might have some points in general, like in general, so folks in this context should think about involving parents in special ed in this way. And in general, they need to think about involving parents in special ed in these particular ways. And then in that section, you would want to have some next steps or a call to action. So again, these things might be blended, but one of the things I see is a common mistake is not being specific enough as to what people should do. What are your recommendations? You can even think about, like, are you talking to a principal, a higher education administrator? Like, think about talking to a colleague. What would you tell them to do based on your research? One of the things I find really useful in writing a discussion, there's two things actually. One is that I make bullet points as I write my findings of things to like think about in the discussion or come back to in the discussion. It's okay if you've already written your findings and you haven't done that. The second thing I do is I actually will often speak my discussion into a voice recorder because there's something it's really hard to write for some reason, at least for me. Like I often need to sort of be like, what am I trying to say? What are my main points here? And then I speak it into a recorder. Sometimes it's on a walk or something like that. And then I translate it into my discussion later. So I'm going to do an example from my recent study, 2019, about teacher learning. I'm using that example in part because you are familiar with the findings now. So just seeing how do we translate, it's got both quantitative and qualitative, and how do we translate those into a discussion. So here is the discussion of that paper, Hayes et al. 2019. And I'm going to just point out a number of different things here that are all highlighted, pre-highlighted. So the first sentence is essentially a summary. These results demonstrate a reported increase in incorporation of stewardship and practices over the course of participation in the 4-month institute. So this is a summary of the quantitative findings, right? The quantitative changes were surprisingly substantive. And then I give a little bit of detail, and that's fairly common in your discussion. So this first sentence is really overarching. The next sentence is somewhat overarching. And then I give just enough, like one sentence of detail, right? The change of standard deviation. And remember, the findings actually have quite a lot of quantitative stuff, and I only give one little piece, right? So it's really important not to rewrite your findings in your discussion. You want to pull out the most important argument from your findings. Then I connect it to the literature. Many PD efforts demonstrate much smaller effect sizes in relation to shifts in practice, right? So that's kind of, and then I cite a bunch of literature, actually quite a lot of literature. So I'm saying, hey, RPD is pretty awesome. Now I use that detail, this is fairly uncommon, but I use that detail to then go back to my overall purpose, which I do right here in the last sentence in this paragraph. Understanding these processes is pivotal for environmental educators, yet understudied in the environmental education research field. Now I'm publishing this in environmental education, so I'm making this argument to my audience. Then I talk about the theory we used, right? We framed our study with Clark and Hollingsworth theory. And again, another purpose, in order to test and refine this theory in an environmental education context, we first measured teacher initial belief alignment, and then now I'm getting into a summary, demonstrates a relatively high alignment between teacher beliefs and institute philosophies. So I'm saying that in sum, you know, we know that this is one of the things that came out of the findings. All right, now I go on and give a little bit of detail. You can certainly look at this yourself. Again, continuing to summarize the findings here. Our qualitative analysis explored the additional processes by which this happened. And then now I'm going to talk about each process. In the second process, and I know you looked at these a little bit more closely in the findings. So in the second process, the teachers referenced the important role the Institute played as a source of new information that helped their conceptions. And then I tie it to the literature. The important role of new ideas to complement existing expertise has been documented elsewhere, as has the role of environmental literacy in fostering EE instructional practices, right? So I'm tying it to the literature. Then I summarize the third process here, and I tie it to the literature. All right. And I also make a point about the theoretical framework. So I tie it to the literature here with Guskey, and then I talk about the theoretical framework around Clark and Hollingsworth. Now I do that, you know, the fourth process and so on. So I'm not going to cover each of those, but I essentially spend a paragraph talking about each of the main points. Now you're only summarizing one theme, so you may only have one paragraph summarizing the findings and connecting it to the literature, and that is fine. Now, so that's moving on. So that's the summary piece and the discussion piece from the assignment. Now I'm moving into the implications, all right? Often people say, you may want theoretical implications, implications for practice, and implications for policy. All we're asking of you in the pilot study is implications for practice. So that's what I'm going to focus on. So I make this argument, and again, remember, I am making an argument with this paper. That's a really important piece. And I'm also trying to support people out in the field doing work, right? So I say, these results demonstrate the power of programs that infuse relevant pedagogical and environmental knowledge, strategies, and tools, and then importantly, hold teachers to high expectations and simultaneously provide high support and provide opportunities for teachers to reflect on student learning, right? So I'm saying, here's some pieces of a PD that are useful based on this study. Moreover, PD that clearly integrates environmental education strategies with state standards can foster a process by which teachers make sense of how to implement environmental education. So I'm thinking about my audience of environmental educators and saying, let's incorporate state science standards in our environmental education PD. And then I call it most importantly, we found that teachers had aligned beliefs, but did not know how to translate them into their teaching practice in light of the complex barriers to change, okay? And then I talk about what it means that we need enactment of observation sense making. And I go on, right? So, but basically, this is the idea that I want someone who's an environmental educator or a professional development provider to have some advice to take up from this study in my implications. All right. So you can use what folks write in your example dissertation as an example. You can use this as an example. You could use another published article as an example. As you write your discussion, which I'm going to pull up the assignment again. So again, note that I incorporated the summary and the discussion together. So I summarized the findings, I referred to the purpose briefly, and then I brought the literature and theoretical framework into, like, how does it relate back to the literature? And the reason that you do that is that you are now in conversation with the literature. You are at the table with all these people and you are now contributing. And so you're saying in this dinner table conversation, you know, here's what I found and here's how it relates to what you're saying. And then of course the implications are really important because this is how we try to change things towards equity, all right? So that's it on the discussion. Enjoy your writing.